Chat link. It was the end of October 2013, and the season was changing fast in the Bear Ridge National Forest. Mornings came colder, daylight vanished quicker, and by now the campgrounds had emptied. Most trails were shut down or lightly trafficked, too chilly for tourists, too quiet for trouble. But for Daniel Rourke, it was his favorite time of year. The solitude, the crisp air, the sense of being alone but never lost. He'd patrolled these mountains for over 20 years. There wasn't a bend in the trail or a tree line he didn't know by heart. That morning, Daniel clocked in just after 6:40 a.m., according to radio logs. He grabbed his standard day pack, water, flare, map, medical kit, and told the dispatcher he was checking Section 7, the northwest corridor near Timberline Ridge. It was routine, trail maintenance, hazard checks, and maybe a brief detour to mark storm-damaged areas ahead of the first snow. Nothing about it felt unusual. No red flags, no urgency. Just another day alone in the woods. He drove his department-issued truck down the old logging road, parking at an overgrown service turnout a few miles from the ranger station. Tire tracks in the dirt would later confirm he was the only vehicle out there that day. Daniel left no note, but that wasn't uncommon. He was a solo worker by nature, quiet, competent, methodical. If anything was off, no one would have known. By nightfall, no one had heard back from him. Still, there wasn't immediate panic. Rangers occasionally worked overtime or lost radio contact in dense areas. When his truck remained unmoved the next morning, a junior ranger drove out to the turnout. Daniel's vehicle was still there, locked, with his logbook on the front seat and his field radio clipped to the dash. That's when the call went in. Possible missing ranger. Status: unknown. What followed was a methodical multi-agency search. First responders arrived within hours. Helicopters were scrambled from neighboring counties. Dogs were brought in. The terrain was steep, covered in fallen leaves and slick patches of moss from last week's rainfall. But the area wasn't overly dangerous, not for someone like Daniel. He'd been through worse. He'd trained others in survival protocols. He wasn't the kind of man who made careless mistakes. Day one turned up nothing. No torn clothing, no scuff marks, not even a broken branch that might suggest where he'd gone. By the end of day two, his coworkers were starting to say it out loud. This didn't feel like a routine rescue. They brought in his family. His younger brother Greg flew in from Colorado, visibly shaken. Greg told investigators that Daniel had never once talked about quitting or disappearing. He loved his job. It was his life. No history of depression, no enemies. He'd even renewed his backcountry certification just a few weeks earlier. The press caught wind of the search by day 3. Journalists from 2 local news outlets hiked out, with crews, capturing images of volunteers trudging through dense timber and across rocky ledges with no sign of where Daniel had gone. He had vanished without leaving a single visible trace behind. Investigators pulled Daniel's GPS logs and analyzed his past patrol patterns. He almost always looped through the ridgeline and circled back before dusk. A conservative hiker, always on schedule, always within range. So why now? Why here? His phone signal was a dead end. No pings after 9:03 a.m., possibly shut off or lost early in the hike. One search team found a faint boot print along the edge of a dry creek bed, possibly Daniel's, but it wasn't conclusive. Too partial to cast, and no other prints nearby. It was like he'd walked straight into thin air. Back at the station, staff scoured his locker and recent reports. Nothing out of the ordinary, except one small detail. A notation in his October 26th shift log that simply read, "Check perimeter, fence post number 23 sagging again." Fence post 23 marked the beginning of a decommissioned firebreak trail that hadn't been maintained in over a decade, technically outside his assigned sweep area. So why go there? Crews diverted and searched that section thoroughly. Hours passed, still nothing. As the days stretched into a week, hope thinned. The terrain became colder. Wind picked up. Nights dropped below freezing. No shelters had been disturbed. No fire pits, no discarded food wrappers or clothing fibers. For a seasoned ranger, that absence was unsettling. The search was officially scaled back on November 4th. Daniel's brother stayed behind, walking the trails alone in the evenings. He wasn't ready to leave, not without something, even just a clue, but he never found one. By month's end, Daniel Rourke was declared missing under unexplained circumstances. The official report listed possible misadventure, unlikely foul play. But off record, those closest to the case had no real theory. It was as if the forest had simply closed in around him and kept its secret. The only certainty was that his vehicle had never moved, his radio never touched, and his pack, which should have contained survival gear, was never found. But 11 years later, something would surface, buried in soil less than 2 miles from where his boots once left the trail. And it wasn't a body. It was his compass. By the second morning, the urgency around Daniel Rourke's disappearance turned into something heavier. Not panic, not yet, but a deepening sense of confusion. This wasn't a hiker gone off trail. This was a forest ranger, experienced, methodical, the kind of man who logged his steps and double-checked every weather pattern before he left the truck. If someone like that could vanish, it raised questions none of them wanted to say out loud. Search and rescue came in fast. By 7 a.m., 2 Black Hawk helicopters circled the northern quadrant of Bear Ridge, scouring the landscape for signs of movement. Bright clothing, flare smoke, anything that would break up the endless canopy of pine. K-9 units were brought in from across the state. Thermal imaging drones covered the slopes. From the air, the terrain looked peaceful, undisturbed, even beautiful. But down on the ground, every shadow seemed like it might be hiding something. The teams began by sweeping outward from Daniel's last known location, his locked truck at the old service turnout. A few boot impressions were recovered early on, but they quickly overlapped with dozens more left behind by searchers. Whatever original trail Daniel may have made was being erased hour by hour. Still, they pushed through. 10-mile sweeps, elevation scans, emergency ping towers were activated, but his phone showed no signal activity after mid-morning on the day he vanished. Daniel's coworkers joined the effort directly. No one believed he'd just wandered off. "He was the one who trained us," one ranger later said. "If you dropped him blindfolded in that forest, he'd still come out on schedule." It wasn't bravado. Daniel had once located a lost hiker using nothing more than a broken pine branch and a half-eaten protein bar. He didn't improvise. He didn't guess. He knew those woods better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, so why couldn't they find him? Over the next 72 hours, the operation grew. ATVs, horse teams, and dozens of volunteers moved in a coordinated grid. The base camp turned into a full-blown command center. Coffee pots ran non-stop. Maps were pinned with color-coded flags. The sheriff gave updates twice a day, usually saying the same thing. "We're following every lead." But there weren't any. No flares, no campfire remains, no signs of struggle or wildlife activity. It was a blank slate. On day 4, the mood began to shift. The crews were still professional, still pushing, but behind the radio chatter and checklists, there was a growing discomfort. It was like the forest wasn't giving anything back, not a piece of clothing, not a thread. That was the part that gnawed at everyone. A man that prepared should have left some trace. The fact that he hadn't, it didn't feel natural. Speculation began, quiet at first. A ranger mentioned that maybe Daniel had a health episode, stroke, heart failure, something sudden that dropped him in the middle of nowhere. But the timeline didn't fit. He was in excellent condition. His medical records showed no signs of heart issues. Besides, even if he collapsed, his gear would have been found nearby. That's what stuck out. There was no gear, no backpack, no water bottle, nothing. Another theory started circulating, one that made people uncomfortable even to suggest. What if he didn't want to be found? Daniel was a private man, sure. He didn't talk much about his personal life. Never married, no kids. He was friendly but quiet, more at home in the field than around a dinner table. But according to his brother, Greg, there were no warning signs, no cryptic goodbyes. He'd just refinanced his mortgage, had upcoming dental work, little things that suggested he wasn't going anywhere. But when people vanish without a trace, others start looking for reasons that might not exist. The rumor mill picked up. Some speculated he might have staged it, parked the truck, walked out with a change of clothes, and disappeared into another life. But that idea didn't hold. His bank account hadn't moved. His passport was still at home. There were no large withdrawals, no online activity, no trace on traffic cams outside the area. Even Greg rejected the idea outright. "That's not my brother," he said. He was grounded, committed. If he needed to leave, he would have said something. Still, whispers lingered. Others offered darker theories. What if he encountered someone out there, a squatter, a fugitive, a transient who didn't want to be seen? Bear Ridge had hundreds of square miles of terrain that wasn't regularly patrolled. There were stories over the years, hikers stumbling onto old cabins, sometimes hearing voices late at night. None of it ever confirmed, but it painted a backdrop that made people uneasy. Then came the fifth day. No new leads, no new evidence. Crews began pulling back, not stopping but narrowing the search, focusing on known hazard zones, old mine shafts, cliff drop-offs, avalanche-prone slopes. They mapped everyone, rechecked logs, even brought in a sonar rig to scan a small glacial lake near the trailhead. Nothing. What haunted everyone was how precise Daniel had always been. He was the man who never got lost, who never cut corners, who radioed in every checkpoint and double-bagged his maps. The idea that he just stepped into the trees and disappeared, it didn't add up. And yet, that's exactly what had happened. By day 7, no one wanted to say it out loud, but the reality was setting in. Either something had gone very wrong out there, or something else entirely had taken place, something no one could yet explain. And soon, one cryptic clue would surface. A water-damaged page tucked under a rock, in what looked like Daniel's own handwriting. A page that mentioned light and pressure in the skull. By day 9, the search was no longer about recovery. It was about reconciling reality with the growing possibility that something about this disappearance didn't fit the usual playbook. Every mapped zone had been combed, every logging road, every ridge trail. Yet there was still no trace of Daniel Rourke. No body, no gear, no sign he had ever left that truck on foot. The logical paths had run dry. That's when the investigators were forced to look beyond the boundaries, literally. The terrain northwest of Bear Ridge is dotted with forgotten trails, unofficial, unmarked, and long since removed from modern maps. These weren't recreation routes. They were scars from another era, leftovers from mining. Operations abandoned in the early 1900s. Over the years, they'd become legends among local hunters and hikers, places you didn't go without a partner, and only in daylight. The Park Service had closed most of them off decades ago due to rockfall risks, unstable shafts, and zero accessibility for emergency crews. But in theory, they were still reachable. And if Daniel had reason to check one, maybe responding to an old report or following a broken fence line, he might have gone in alone. It wasn't procedure, but Daniel wasn't reckless. He was precise. So when someone brought up the possibility of the unmapped zone, most dismissed it. Until Greg stepped in. He remembered something. A conversation from a few weeks before the disappearance. Daniel had mentioned a weird hollow near Timberline Ridge, a place he'd only stumbled into once years ago. He said it gave him a headache just walking through it. He hadn't been back since. It was the first time anyone had a tangible direction. Greg flagged the location on an old topo map, an area east of a natural ravine, just outside official patrol territory. Within hours, a private search team was granted limited access, including a handler with a cadaver dog named Rio, known for previous successful recoveries in mountainous terrain. It was unofficial, off-record, and done quietly. No media, no press release. Just a silent hope that something might finally break. 3 hours into the hike, the team reached the ravine. It was deep but dry, choked with decades of fallen timber and decaying brush. Rio moved slowly at first, then became alert, tail rigid, nose tracking along a narrow slope near a boulder cluster. Then he barked, twice, sharply, an indicator for possible scent. The handler marked the area and began a preliminary dig, no more than 6 inches deep. They found nothing. No fabric, no bone, no remains. But the dog stayed fixated for over 20 minutes, pacing the same 10-foot radius. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it wasn't nothing either. The handler noted something else. The air felt wrong. Not bad. Not foul. Just dense. Like a barometric pressure drop before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear. That was brushed off as environmental noise. Heat pockets, humidity shifts. But still, it was recorded in the report. another strange footnote in a file that kept getting stranger. The team was packing up when one of the volunteers called out. About 500 yards upslope from the ravine, wedged beneath a flat stone slab, was a torn piece of spiral notebook paper. It was yellowed, curled at the edges, and damp from groundwater. The ink had bled in spots, but a few lines were legible, and at the bottom, 2 initials, DR. The note was taken into custody by the sheriff's department. Forensics confirmed the paper type matched a brand often stocked at ranger stations. A handwriting analyst was brought in. The conclusion wasn't definitive, but leaned toward, likely match, Daniel's handwriting, with some irregularities likely caused by duress or environmental damage. The contents of the note were brief. "Third time today, pressure in my skull. Sharp, low-frequency hum. No wind, but treetops moving. I thought I saw lights in the hollow. Not fire, not eyes. I don't feel right. Need to get out, can't seem to find the ridge." There was no date, no signature, just the scrawled initials. But for Greg, it was unmistakable. The phrasing, the clipped syntax, that was his brother's voice. Investigators went silent for 2 days after the note was found. No public update, no timeline for follow-up. When pressed, officials said the evidence was under review, and the search remained open but limited. In reality, the discovery had fractured the case. If Daniel had written it, he was alive, at least at that point. And if he wasn't hallucinating, he may have encountered something in those woods that went far beyond an accident. But what? The phrase, "pressure in my skull," caught attention. Medical experts suggested possibilities: altitude sickness, dehydration, or even carbon monoxide exposure, common in mining zones with trapped gas pockets. But Daniel would have recognized the signs. He'd trained for that. The mention of lights raised more questions. Flashlights, campfires, other hikers? If so, where were they? Why didn't they come forward? That's when another question emerged. Who tucked the note under the rock? If Daniel had written it in distress, he might have left it hoping someone would find it. But why not leave more? Why not use his emergency beacon? And how did a piece of paper survive nearly 9 days exposed to the elements, tucked in a spot that looked deliberately chosen? The ravine was researched, but again yielded nothing. Rio didn't alert a second time. Whatever had triggered him before was either gone or buried deeper than they could access safely. With no new evidence, the official search was once again scaled back. Daniel Rourke had been missing for 10 days, and now there was a note. Frightening, fragmented, and maybe not the last. The forecast hadn't called for it, not exactly. There were mentions of a cold front, some early flurries at elevation, but nothing like what hit Bear Ridge on November 12th, 11 days after Daniel Rourke vanished. The snow came in hard and fast, dumping nearly 30 inches across the northern slopes in just under 40 hours. Roads vanished. Helicopters were grounded. Trails that had been carefully flagged and combed were buried in silence. The storm put an immediate stop to all active search efforts. Volunteer groups were told to stand down. Access roads iced over. Even the command post near Timberline Trailhead had to be evacuated when the power failed. For 2 full weeks, nothing moved. It wasn't the first time. Old-timers in the region had a name for it, the Ridge Curse, a half-serious, half-folklore belief. That strange weather always seemed to follow strange disappearances in that part of the forest. Rangers shrugged it off publicly, but privately, more than a few admitted it was uncanny. Over the past 20 years, 3 people had gone missing within a 5-mile radius of where Daniel disappeared. In all 3 cases, the same thing happened. A freak, early-season storm rolled in within days, sometimes hours, of the incident. Search efforts slowed, sometimes stopped completely. And in all 3 cases, the missing were never found. Of course, weather is just weather, but the pattern lingered in people's minds. Daniel's brother Greg didn't believe in curses, not at first, but he believed in timing. And this storm felt wrong, too sudden, too precise. It shut down access just when momentum had started building, after the ravine alert, after the torn notebook page, just when things were getting close to something. Now everything was on ice, literally. Greg stayed. He moved into a cheap roadside motel near the ranger station, checking forecasts obsessively, logging every small update from park officials. He wasn't convinced the storm was just nature doing what nature does. He began asking questions. about the mining history, about the gas pocket theories, about whether the park had sensors in that area that might have picked up anomalies. He got few answers. Most rangers were polite but tight-lipped. The sheriff's office told him to be patient. "The weather will break. We'll get back out there," they said. But 2 weeks is a long time when you're waiting for permission to grieve. When the snow finally began to melt, crews returned to the zone. But it was no longer the same terrain. Markers had shifted, soil was frozen, some areas were completely inaccessible due to avalanche risk. Search dogs couldn't detect scent through ice. What had once been a promising window had now closed, or at the very least been frosted over. The ravine was iced solid. The exact rock where the notebook page had been found was now buried under a foot of packed snow. Rio, the cadaver dog, had been rotated out. A new dog showed no alerts. And the pressure changed again, not in the atmosphere, but within the case itself. Leads stalled. The media moved on. Greg noticed that the updates from the sheriff's office became shorter, fewer boots on the ground, fewer hours logged. He asked to see the handwriting analysis on the notebook page. He was told it wasn't available for release. He asked if the area around the ravine had been scanned for radiation or gas leaks. No comment. He pushed harder, emails, calls, FOIA requests. Some went unanswered, others were returned with generic statements. No further findings at this time. That's when Greg began to wonder if something was being withheld. He didn't believe in conspiracies, but the lack of transparency felt deliberate. It wasn't just that they hadn't found Daniel, it was that no one seemed to be looking with the same intensity anymore. And worse, it felt like certain questions made people uncomfortable. Every time he brought up the notebook, the mention of pressure in the skull, the lights, he was met with a change in tone, a look, a pause before the answer. At first, he thought maybe they suspected Daniel had experienced a mental break, something sudden, neurological, a seizure, a stroke, maybe a previously undiagnosed condition, but that still didn't explain the missing gear or why no body had surfaced after so much time and effort. The family pressed for medical records. Daniel had passed every recent physical. No anomalies, no medications, no symptoms of anything that would impair his judgment. And if he had suffered a psychotic episode, why had he written clearly? Why had he tried to describe what he saw? People in crisis don't stop to tuck notes under rocks. They don't write about frequency and light in clean, deliberate lines. Greg's frustration boiled over in a meeting with local authorities. He asked directly, "Was there something in that ravine? Something that wasn't just terrain?" The response was vague. They said no physical threats had been found, no evidence of foul play, no unusual radiation or gas readings. But what Greg heard was something else. "We're done looking." The official search was declared suspended on December 3rd. 23 days after Daniel Rourke disappeared. Not closed, not resolved, just put on indefinite hold until new evidence emerged. The forest was quiet again. But Greg wasn't, and in the coming months he would start gathering everything himself, maps, trail logs, weather data, trying to figure out what it was that moved just beneath the surface, because the storm may have buried the trail, but it hadn't buried the questions. 3 months after the official search was suspended, a man named Nolan Bridger arrived quietly at Bear Ridge. He wasn't part of law enforcement, not a volunteer. He was a civilian tracker, 61 years old, former military SEER instructor, now semi-retired but still consulted for difficult missing persons cases. Nolan had heard about Daniel's disappearance through a friend in the sheriff's office. He wasn't paid. He didn't want credit. He just said, "Let me walk the site." Greg Rourke met him at the ranger station. It was late February, still cold, but the lower elevations had started to thaw. They reviewed Daniel's patrol logs, the notebook page, and the coordinates of the turnout where his truck had been found. Nolan said very little. He spent most of the day studying terrain maps, cross-referencing elevation grades, drainage paths, wind direction. By the second morning, he was on foot, retracing Daniel's presumed route with nothing but a walking stick, a notepad, and a thermos of black coffee. Over the years, hundreds of prints had been trampled into that soil by volunteers, search teams, wildlife. Most of it was noise now, but Bridger knew how to sift through noise. He focused on secondary terrain, Edges of switchbacks, rock shadows, places others wouldn't naturally walk unless they were moving off trail. That's where he found something strange. It was subtle. A half-worn impression in hardened dirt just off the ridgeline. A boot tread facing east, slightly angled, consistent with the make and size Daniel typically wore. It wasn't new, but it had held shape under a rocky overhang. About 10 feet ahead, Nolan found a second print. But this one didn't match. It was smaller, narrower, and barefoot. He kept following the ridge. Every few steps another partial print would show, always in pairs, and one booted, one bare. Then they separated. The boot tracks curved sharply toward the south basin. The barefoot ones veered northeast, downhill into heavy brush. Both sets faded after 30 yards. No blood, no gear, no signs of struggle. Back at the station, Nolan logged the discovery with a written report. 2 individuals exited the ridge. One shod, one barefoot. Stride patterns consistent with urgency or confusion. No overlap. Suggest possible split. When the sheriff's department reviewed it, they confirmed what Greg had already begun to fear. None of the original search logs documented barefoot prints in that zone. Not one. That begged the question, was someone else with Daniel that day? Greg was stunned. Daniel never hiked with others. He preferred to be alone. It was part of the job and part of his nature. Introverted, deliberate. If he had invited someone along, he would have told someone, left a note, filed a joint patrol log, something. And there had been no missing persons reports filed around the time of his disappearance that fit a second party. No campers, no hikers, no unidentified vehicles near the turnout. The barefoot prints complicated everything. It changed the scale of the investigation, from a single missing person to a possible unknown subject. But what kind of person wanders into steep backcountry with no shoes, injured, mentally unstable, escaping something? And if Daniel had found them, would he have broken protocol to help? Greg began combing through his brother's old notebooks, looking for anything. Any mention of a distressed hiker, strange behavior, someone loitering near trailheads. Nothing surfaced. Daniel's logs were neat, structured, all business, no warnings, no suspicions. It was as if this other person had simply appeared from nowhere. There were theories, of course. Some investigators suggested maybe Daniel had removed his own shoes, hypothermic disorientation, a rare but documented phenomenon in the final stages of exposure. But the stride patterns didn't support that. Bridger had studied the gait length. Both sets of tracks maintained a stable rhythm for at least 30 feet before diverging. No staggering, no dragging. Whoever was barefoot, they were moving with purpose. A psychiatric angle was considered next. Could Daniel have suffered a mental break, removed his boots, imagined another person, or created the illusion himself? But again, the sizes didn't match. The bear prints were too small, too narrow, not his. And even if he'd been in distress, the presence of 2 separate trails moving in opposite directions made no psychological sense. It was as if 2 people had been there, walking side by side, until one chose the ravine and the other vanished into the brush. Greg pressed law enforcement to reopen the investigation based on Bridger's findings. They acknowledged the anomaly, but stopped short of escalation. There was no physical evidence beyond the prints, no DNA, no belongings, no recent sightings. One detective suggested it could have been a lost transient. "People live off the grid out here," he said. "You'd be surprised what you find when you're not looking." But Greg wasn't satisfied. He believed the prints were connected, that whoever had been out there, barefoot, wasn't just a coincidence. And more importantly, he believed Daniel encountered them. Whether that person needed help or meant harm remained unanswered. Bridger left the area a week later. He didn't offer conclusions, just this: tracks don't lie, but they don't talk either. The report was filed away, mostly ignored. But to Greg, it changed everything. Because Daniel hadn't been alone, and someone else had walked into the forest that day, without boots, without a name, and without a trace. By spring, the official investigation into Daniel Rourke's disappearance had slowed to a trickle. The forest had reopened, snow had melted, and most of the search teams were long gone. What was once a coordinated rescue mission had now become a file in a cabinet, still open, technically, but no longer active. No new evidence, no new leads. Just silence. But the forest wasn't done speaking. It started with a report from a hunter. He was in his 60s, local, known by the rangers, not the type to exaggerate. He said he saw a man walking along the old fire road, an access route that had been closed off since 2002 due to erosion and landslides. It was around 5:30 in the morning. First light. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like a green field jacket. The man didn't respond to the hunter's calls, didn't even look, just kept walking, slow, deliberate, until he vanished into the tree line near Switchback 7. No footprints were found in the soft earth later that day. A few weeks later, a couple hiking a restricted ridge trail claimed they heard someone calling out. A man's voice, hoarse but distinct. It said one word, again and again: Greg. They didn't know the name meant anything. They just thought it was strange, and they reported it on a trail form later that night. A ranger flagged the post and forwarded it to the sheriff's office. Greg read it 3 times, then saved it to a growing folder on his laptop. It wasn't the only report. Over the next 2 months, there were 5 more incidents, each from different people, different times. A camper said he heard footsteps outside his tent just before dawn, slow and heavy. When he stepped out, there was no one there, but he claimed his compass needle was spinning erratically. A solo backpacker said he caught a glimpse of someone crouched behind a tree about 50 feet off the trail. When he called out, the figure stood up and walked into the brush, again without answering. None of these sightings could be confirmed. No one captured video. No one got close. But every one of them happened within the same quadrant, the northern range near the original search zone and the ravine where Daniel's note had been found. Law enforcement reviewed the claims, but without physical evidence, there wasn't much to investigate. It could have been a squatter, an illegal hunter, a case of mistaken identity. The woods played tricks on people, they said, especially those who already had the idea in their heads. Greg didn't buy it. He started logging everything: dates, times, GPS points, weather conditions. He made maps, built a spreadsheet. He reached out to every person who had filed an unofficial report. Some didn't respond. Others gave him more detail than what was in the official logs, small things that felt important. One woman said the figure she saw had a strange posture, like he was leaning forward but not limping. Another described the eyes, wide, like he was shocked to be seen. Greg took all of it seriously, because by now he wasn't sure what kind of answers he was chasing anymore, just that something was still moving out there. He hiked the forest almost daily that summer, not aimlessly. Always with a destination, returning to the ravine, the old turnout, the decommissioned fire road. He kept to the edges, watching for movement, listening, sometimes camping overnight. He never saw anything, but he started noticing patterns. At certain spots, his compass wouldn't settle. Just a few feet in either direction, and it would correct itself. He brought a second compass, same result. Then he used a handheld EMF meter. The readings spiked randomly in one small area near the fire road, then dropped to 0. A geologist he later consulted told him it could have been magnetic mineral deposits. Perfectly natural, he said. Greg didn't argue, but he made a note anyway. By August, Greg had gathered enough to fill 2 binders. He submitted them to the sheriff's office, asking for the case to be reviewed. The request was declined, politely but firmly. No new forensic evidence, no legal grounds to reopen. Daniel's file was quietly archived. Greg kept going. He filed his own FOIA requests, spoke to park maintenance crews, checked ranger patrol logs for any unusual activity that might have gone unnoticed. That's when he found a note buried in an old maintenance report from 2 years before Daniel vanished. A ranger named Elias had filed a complaint about someone accessing the decommissioned fire road at night. No person was ever found. The report was closed, but it raised a question. Had someone been living out there? Greg started exploring the theory himself. He talked to survivalists, off-grid enthusiasts. Most said the same thing. It's possible, but incredibly difficult. Harsh winters, limited resources, but not impossible, especially for someone who didn't want to be found. So what if Daniel hadn't vanished by accident? What if he found someone? And what if that someone didn't want to be found? Again. The reports didn't stop. A ranger heard something move behind a tree line during a solo sweep, said it didn't sound like an animal. A trail camera picked up a blurry figure in the early morning light, but it was too distorted to analyze. Greg printed the photo anyway. taped it to the wall next to Daniel's badge. Because whatever haunted Bear Ridge now wasn't just memory. It was moving, watching, and it knew his name. It arrived in an unmarked box with no return address, no postage date, and no accompanying note. Just a package dropped on Greg Rourke's porch on a Tuesday morning in June 2024. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic and sealed with duct tape, was something he hadn't seen in over a decade, a rusted brass compass, familiar at first glance despite the corrosion. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. Daniel's compass. The initials were still there, barely visible now. DR, etched on the inside lid just the way Daniel had marked all his field gear. A simple thing. Habitual, almost meaningless to anyone else. But Greg recognized it instantly. His brother never went into the field without it. It had been missing since the day he disappeared. Search teams had scoured his gear logs, trying to account for everything. Uniform, boots, pack, radio. The compass had never turned up. And now, 11 years later, it just appeared. Greg didn't touch it at first. He stared at it for nearly an hour before finally taking it to a private lab technician in Spokane who specialized in environmental trace analysis. He wanted answers, not guesses. He asked for everything. Fingerprints, soil residue, mineral content, anything that could point to where it had been and who might have had it. The results came back a week later. No fingerprints. The casing had been wiped clean, likely more than once, but wedged inside the hinge, just a trace amount, was compacted dirt. It had been preserved, sealed beneath the rust, and the technician was able to break it down. It was granitic sediment mixed with a particular type of iron-rich silt not found in most areas of Bear Ridge, except for one place, a narrow elevation band in the northern quadrant of the forest, an area once flagged for search early on, then later closed off after a rockslide in 2015 made it officially unsafe for foot traffic. The same region where the notebook page had been discovered near the ravine. The same sector where Greg had seen those strange compass anomalies, where hikers had reported sightings, where the trail cameras had picked up blurred movement at dawn. Greg brought the findings to the sheriff's department. This time, they listened. Not because they suddenly believed in ghost stories or wilderness phantoms, but because the compass was real, tangible, physical, and it had clearly moved. Someone had it, someone kept it, someone returned it, and that someone knew exactly who Greg was and where to send it. For the first time in nearly a decade, the case file was reopened. Quietly, no press release. Just a discreet call to the state forensics unit and a soft reactivation of the original missing person designation. They logged the compass, photographed it, and began mapping out the precise coordinates of the soil match. That zone, once labeled Sector 14, hadn't been accessed officially since the rock slide. The cliffs were unstable, and no formal trails led through it anymore. But it wasn't unreachable. Rangers had occasionally used the ridgeline above for firewatch patrols, and hunters still passed near the perimeter in dry seasons. If someone had been living there, hiding there, it was possible they could have entered and exited without detection. The working theory evolved quickly. The compass hadn't just been lost and found, it had been kept, preserved, then returned with intent, which raised a new question. Why now? Whoever sent it hadn't left a message, no demands, no confession, just the object itself, handed off like a challenge, or a clue. And Greg couldn't let it go. He revisited his maps, cross-referenced the soil sample locations with thermal imaging overlays from past wildfire scans. One narrow stretch stood out just beneath the east-facing cliff line, where a natural overhang had once been flagged as a potential shelter zone. It had been briefly searched in the early days, but terrain reports marked it high risk. Teams hadn't returned after the first snowfall. That's where the dirt matched. Greg petitioned the Forestry Service for temporary access, citing the renewed evidence. He was denied twice. The area was still considered unstable. Landslide warnings were active. But Greg went anyway, alone, just like Daniel had. He didn't go looking for answers that day. Not really. He went to feel the ground, to walk the slope, to try and see what his brother might have seen in those final moments, if they were final. The air was heavy with heat and silence. The trees were too still. Every step felt wrong. At the base of the overhang, he stopped. Someone had been there. A pile of stones, 6 or 7, stacked carefully, sat beside a moss-covered root. It wasn't natural. It wasn't debris. It was a cairn. Greg didn't disturb it. He marked the GPS location and hiked back out. That night, he sat in his apartment with the compass resting on the table in front of him. For the first time, he opened it fully. The needle was broken, spinning freely, but still balanced enough to point somewhere. Northwest. Right toward Sector 14. There were too many questions now. Too many threads that no longer fit inside the original theory of an accidental death or a solo disappearance. And the fact that someone had waited 11 years to return something so personal, it didn't feel random. It felt planned. Because whoever sent the compass didn't just want Greg to remember. They wanted him to follow. By late summer of 2024, permission was granted. Quietly, under strict conditions, no media, no press, and only a skeleton crew on site. The official language called it a limited access terrain re-examination, but everyone involved knew what it really was. A dig. The kind you only do when something or someone needs to be found. Sector 14 had been off limits for almost a decade. After the 2015 rockslide, the cliffs above the old mine corridor were deemed unstable, and even the most seasoned rangers avoided the area. But the compass changed that. It gave a precise soil signature, mineral content only present in a narrow band of the elevation range near the collapsed entrance of a forgotten mine shaft. They called it Dig Site 14. The team was small. 2 forensic specialists, 1 geotechnical engineer, and a sheriff's deputy acting as site lead. Greg was allowed to observe from the perimeter. He didn't speak much. He just watched hour after hour as they scraped away layers of dirt in slow, careful passes, every movement logged, photographed, and tagged. By mid-afternoon, the trowel hit something solid. It wasn't rock. Roughly 10 inches below the surface, beneath a tangle of old root systems and packed soil, the lead technician uncovered a strip of dark green fabric. Torn, weathered, but unmistakably part of a standard-issue forest ranger's jacket. Just a fragment, no badge, no zipper, no seams. But Greg recognized the texture. It was the same type Daniel wore on every patrol. The fabric was tagged and bagged, no blood, no tissue, just dirt. But it wasn't all they found. 2 inches to the left of the fabric, buried deliberately in its own small hollow, was something already familiar. Another compass. The same make, same brass casing. But this one wasn't rusted. It was intact, clean, untouched by time. When they opened it, there were no initials. But the internal wear, the scratches across the lens, the tension in the hinge. It was Daniel's, the original. The one that should have been in his pack the day he disappeared, which meant the first compass, the one Greg received in the mail, was a replica, a fake. Someone had copied it, and someone had buried the real one, very deliberately. The discovery reoriented the entire case. The assumption had always been that Daniel had the compass on him when he vanished, but now it was clear. Someone else had it, had kept it, and for reasons unknown had chosen to bury it alongside the fabric next to a collapsed shaft in an area no one had permission to access. The question was why. Forensics moved quickly. Soil samples were collected from every layer. The area was scanned with ground-penetrating radar, but no human remains were detected within a 15-foot radius. Still, they excavated deeper. Nothing. No bones, no clothing, no equipment, just the compass and the cloth. And something else, a partial footprint in the soil just west of the dig. It was faint, but visible enough to cast. The soil was moist, protected under the rock overhang, and it had preserved the outline in remarkable detail. When the cast dried, the measurements came back. Men's size 9, narrow width, arch flattened by weight. Greg knew immediately it wasn't Daniel's. His brother wore a size 12. This print belonged to someone else. The forensic report noted that the step depth was shallow. Whomever made it wasn't running, wasn't staggering. They were standing still. Watching, maybe. Or waiting. When the lab results came in 2 weeks later, they confirmed what everyone had already begun to suspect. The compass had been buried no more than 12 months ago. The soil compression, the oxidation rate, the microfungal presence on the fabric, all of it pointed to recent activity. Daniel had disappeared in 2013. But this evidence had been placed in 2023 or later, which meant someone had held onto his belongings for a full decade and then chose to plant them. Greg sat with that truth for days, turning it over in his mind. Someone had the real compass long enough to replicate it, then sent the fake one to lure him back, to lead him to this exact spot. Why? To tease, to threaten, to confess, or to pass a message? The idea that someone else had access to his brother's belongings wasn't new. But the realization that this person was still active, still moving through Bear Ridge, and still watching, it brought a fresh wave of dread. Law enforcement opened a new subfile, unknown individual, custody of evidence. But they had no name, no suspect, just a footprint, a direction, and the realization that someone had been inside the closed sector, recently and quietly, with knowledge of what they were doing. Greg pushed for expanded access to the shaft, but was denied. Structural integrity was too compromised. Any deeper excavation would require full engineering clearance, which could take months, maybe years. In the meantime, the site was sealed, marked with red tape and steel stakes, and labeled Preservation Hold. But Greg knew it wouldn't stay undisturbed for long, because someone had buried something there, and someone else might come back to see if it had been found. The compass hadn't just reappeared, it had been delivered. Intentionally, packaged, sealed, left without a return address. It was the kind of gesture that could have easily been dismissed as anonymous, just another mystery in a case already buried in them. But Greg Rourke wasn't letting it go. And neither was the sheriff's department. The reactivation of the case meant one thing. For the first time in years, they had something new to chase. Digital forensics began with the packaging itself. The box was standard, no markings, no handwriting, but the shipping label contained a postmark code, faint but still intact. It traced back to a small rural town about 200 miles east of Bear Ridge. Population just under 2,000. Nothing unusual on the surface. One gas station, one grocery store, a motel. No known connections to Daniel. But there was a USPS drop box beside the gas station that matched the barcode. Investigators pulled the security footage from the date of the postmark. The surveillance quality was poor, grainy, black and white, no audio. But at 4:43 a.m., a hooded figure appeared in frame. No car visible, no facial recognition possible. The person was tall, wearing a backpack, and carried 4 parcels, one of which matched the dimensions of the box Greg had received. They dropped them in the mailbox, turned, and walked out of frame. That was it. The clerk working that morning didn't remember anyone unusual. No name, no license plate, nothing left behind. But the investigators weren't done. They swabbed the compass again, this time looking beyond fingerprints which had long been wiped clean. This time, they searched for trace biological material, skin cells, oils, sweat residue. A tiny fragment of epithelial tissue was recovered from inside the hinge seam. It wasn't enough for a full profile, but enough for a partial DNA sequence. That was when the case took a sharp turn. The partial DNA did not match Daniel Rourke. That much was clear. But when entered into a national law enforcement database, it triggered a hit. A familial partial match with an open case file out of Idaho, nearly 14 years old. The name was Tyler Marchand, 24 years old, went missing in 2009 while hiking solo in Clearwater State Park, roughly 180 miles north of Bear Ridge. He had never been found. No confirmed sightings, no remains. Just a backpack discovered near a fire road weeks after he vanished. The cases had never been linked. Until now. The sample wasn't strong enough to say the compass had been handled by Tyler directly. But it was consistent with a close relative, possibly a sibling or child, someone biologically connected. And suddenly, Daniel's case wasn't a standalone anymore. It was part of a thread. Greg stared at the screen when the news came in. He remembered the Marchand case, vaguely. It hadn't made national headlines, but it had been circulated in ranger circles because of the strange details. Tyler had radioed a friend mid-hike saying he felt disoriented, said the woods were louder than usual, that something was pulling him off trail. Then the radio cut out, and he was never heard from again. Now, DNA tied the compass to someone in his family line. The implications were staggering. Was it coincidence, contamination, Or had someone, possibly even Tyler, survived, gone underground, and chosen to resurface just long enough to send Greg a message? The sheriff's department sent outreach to the Marchand family. Tyler's brother, Evan, still lived in Montana. He was shocked, said he hadn't heard anything about Bear Ridge, didn't know Daniel Rourke, had no idea why his brother's DNA might show up connected to a missing ranger's compass 11 years later. He agreed to submit a full sample to confirm the match. A week later, results came back. The DNA on the compass didn't belong to Evan. That left only one conclusion. Someone biologically related to Tyler Marchand had handled Daniel's compass in the last 12 months. But Tyler had no known children, no listed partners. His family thought he'd died in the woods, and yet the DNA link was real. The investigation pivoted. Search records from surrounding state parks were re-examined. Rangers from Idaho and Montana were re-interviewed. A list of missing persons cases from 2005 to 2015 in the Pacific Northwest was compiled and sorted by proximity and pattern. More than a dozen names surfaced. Most were discounted, but 3, Tyler Marchand, Eliza Reams, 2007, and Nathan Kellogg, 2011, stood out. All had disappeared within a 250-mile radius, all during solo hikes, and all under circumstances involving strange last communications, disorientation, phantom lights, overwhelming pressure, sudden silence. Daniel's case was starting to fit into something broader, something that had been happening quietly, sporadically, and without connection until now. And whoever returned the compass knew all of it. Greg felt it in his gut. This wasn't about closure. It wasn't about solving a disappearance. It was about being led somewhere, nudged. Someone wanted him to keep digging, not just into Daniel's past, but into something older, deeper, something still unfolding. The compass hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from someone who had been watching, waiting. And now, the search wasn't just about Daniel Rourke. It was about who, or what, had been in those forests all along. In the fall of 2024, almost 11 years to the day since Daniel Rourke vanished into the mountains of Bear Ridge, Greg returned to the forest one last time. He didn't bring a crew. No officers, no gear beyond a pack, a flashlight, and a printed topographical map folded tightly into the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't tell anyone he was going either. There had been enough searches, enough theories, enough moments of almost. This wasn't a mission, it was something else, a ritual, a need to walk the places Daniel had walked. One more time. The air was colder than he expected. Not snow yet, but close. The sun was already dipping behind the tree line when Greg reached the ravine. Quiet, steep, and choked with brush. The same ravine where the cadaver dog had alerted, where the note had been found, where something, or someone, had nearly given itself away. It hadn't changed. Not really. But something felt different. Not in the air or the light, but in the ground. There, off to the side, near the base of a gnarled spruce, was a small pile of stones. 6 of them, arranged deliberately, balanced with care. A cairn. It hadn't been there before. Greg knelt down and brushed the stones aside slowly, one by one, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. But buried beneath the last layer of soil was something he recognized immediately. Something so small and yet so specific, it stopped his breath cold. A badge, brushed clean, untarnished, Forest Service, ID number 29,471. Daniels. It wasn't bent, it wasn't corroded. It looked like it had been polished recently, handled, cared for, then placed here like an offering or a signal. Not dropped, not lost, left deliberately. Greg sat with it in his hand for several minutes before sliding it into the inside flap of his coat. He didn't look around. He didn't call out. He just stood and walked out of the forest, retracing his steps in total silence. The badge changed everything. It was physical, recent, and undeniably linked to Daniel. Law enforcement had no choice but to reopen the case. Again. For the 3rd time. The badge was photographed, tested for prints, and submitted to the lab for DNA. The soil around the cairn was sampled, but no other objects were recovered. No fabric, no blood, no bones. The ground gave back only one thing. But it was enough. The forensic results were frustrating. No usable prints, no new DNA. Whoever placed the badge had done it carefully, but the soil content matched the same elevation band as the compass, the northern quadrant, Sector 14. Another match. Still, the badge raised more questions than it answered. If someone had been keeping Daniel's belongings, where had they been for over a decade? Why return them now, and why only in fragments? The compass, then the badge, both sent or placed near significant markers, both personal, intimate, tokens of memory, like breadcrumbs left not to reveal a path forward, but to make someone look back. There was no suspect, no witness, no clear motive. But the cumulative evidence painted a chilling picture. Someone had been in possession of Daniel's gear since 2013. Someone who knew the terrain, someone who had access to closed trails, and who knew just enough about Greg to draw him back again and again, and that someone was still out there. Daniel's file, once again, moved to active status. Federal agencies were looped in this time due to the DNA connection with the Marchand case. But there were no new leads, and no signs of recent habitation in or around Sector 14. Trail cameras were installed. None were triggered. Greg knew what that meant. It was over, not solved, not closed, but over. There would be no recovery, no reunion, no final explanation that tied the past into a clean, understandable shape. There would be fragments, pieces, compass, fabric, badge, whispers and footprints and sightings, but no whole truth. And maybe that was the point, because whoever or whatever had returned, those things hadn't done so out of guilt or remorse. It felt more like a ritual, a performance, a reminder that Daniel hadn't vanished by accident. He had been taken, or chosen. Greg stopped hiking after that fall. He moved out of state the following spring, got a job that didn't touch the forest, didn't require maps or boots or weather radios, but he kept one drawer in his house filled with everything from Bear Ridge, the notebook, the photos, the cast of the footprint, and the badge wrapped in cloth resting beside the broken compass. He never spoke publicly about what he believed happened, not fully. He didn't claim supernatural theories or accuse anyone by name. But when asked once, in a podcast interview, what he thought the truth was, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "I don't think Daniel's body is in those woods. I think only his story is." And maybe that's all Bear Ridge ever held on to, because no bones were ever found, no final message, no confession, just the memory of a man who never got lost, except once, and never came back. Daniel Rourke became another unsolved name in the forest, but his compass had returned, and someone made sure of it.